The ambulance screamed through downtown Phoenix as morning rush hour traffic parted like a reluctant sea. Inside, chaos reigned. A construction worker lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps. Internal bleeding was filling his abdominal cavity while his blood pressure plummeted with each passing second. The nearest trauma center was still 12 minutes away through gridlock streets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. "We're losing him," Marcus Thompson shouted over the wailing sirens, his hands slick with sweat as he struggled to maintain IV access. The seasoned paramedics' usual confidence had evaporated as their patients' vital signs crashed, despite every protocol they'd attempted. Elena Rodriguez knelt quietly in the corner of the ambulance, her voice steady and calm as she spoke words that would change everything. "I need you to pull over. I can save him, but I need to operate now." Marcus spun around, his face twisted with disbelief and rage. "Are you insane? You're equipment tech. Get back in your corner and let the professionals handle this." What Marcus didn't know was that the quiet woman he'd been dismissing and mocking for months had once been the youngest trauma surgeon ever appointed at Johns Hopkins. Her hands had guided countless patients back from the edge of death in operating rooms across 3 continents. But those days felt like a lifetime ago, buried beneath layers of guilt and a promise she'd made to herself to never again hold a scalpel. The patient's monitor began a steady, alarming beep. Cardiac arrest was imminent. Elena looked directly into Marcus's eyes with a steadiness that seemed to cut through the chaos. "He has maybe 90 seconds before his heart stops. I can perform an emergency laparotomy right here, right now. Or you can watch him die while we argue." For a moment, the only sound was the screaming siren and the harsh rhythm of manual ventilation. Marcus had built his reputation on being the toughest, most capable paramedic in Phoenix Metro EMS. He'd never backed down from a challenge or admitted uncertainty, but something in Elena's voice, in the absolute certainty of her words, made him hesitate. The monitor's alarm pierced the air. Time had run out. Elena Rodriguez had perfected the art of invisibility over the past 4 years. At 35, she moved through the corridors of Scottsdale Memorial Hospital like a ghost, her maintenance uniform and quiet demeanor rendering her nearly unnoticed by the medical staff she once called colleagues. Her job as a medical equipment technician kept her busy calibrating monitors, servicing ventilators, and ensuring that the complex machines that sustained life operated flawlessly. It was honest work that let her stay close to medicine without the crushing weight of responsibility she'd once carried. Her small apartment in Ahwatukee reflected the same deliberate simplicity: clean lines, minimal furniture, and carefully controlled emptiness. The only hint of her former life was a small wooden box tucked away in her bedroom closet, containing awards and certifications she couldn't bring herself to display or destroy. A few neighbors knew her as the polite woman who kept to herself, perhaps a divorced professional trying to rebuild her life. None suspected that the quiet figure tending to her small herb garden each evening had once been featured on the cover of Medical Journal Quarterly as one of America's most promising young surgeons. The transition from Dr. Elena Rodriguez to simply Elena had been gradual and deliberate. After the incident that ended her surgical career, she'd moved across the country, changed her professional trajectory, and built a life structured around routine and emotional distance. Her days began at 5:30 with a solitary run through the desert trails, followed by 8 hours of technical work that challenged her intellectually without requiring life-or-death decisions. Evenings were spent reading medical journals, not to stay current with surgical techniques, but because the familiar terminology provided comfort without temptation. 4 months ago, she'd made what seemed like a minor decision to volunteer with the Desert Medical Training Institute, helping teach basic emergency response to community groups. The work satisfied her desire to contribute without stepping back into the high-stakes world of critical care medicine. It was during one of these training sessions that Captain James Harrison of Phoenix Metro EMS had approached her about occasional ride-alongs. The department was implementing a new equipment monitoring program, and they needed someone with technical expertise to evaluate their mobile units under real-world conditions. Elena had hesitated. Climbing back into an ambulance, even as an observer, meant exposing herself to the exact situation she'd spent years avoiding. But Captain Harrison had been persuasive, emphasizing that her role would be purely technical, observing equipment performance rather than patient care. The additional income would be helpful, and the work would only require occasional shifts during her off hours from the hospital. What Elena hadn't anticipated was Marcus Thompson. From her very first ride-along, Marcus had made his opinion of her presence abundantly clear. He was the kind of paramedic who'd built his identity around being the best, the toughest, the one everyone called when situations got complicated. His crew at Station 7 treated him like a legend, and his reputation throughout Phoenix Metro EMS was built on dramatic saves and an uncanny ability to keep patients alive under impossible circumstances. He'd been doing the job for 12 years, had seen everything the Desert City could throw at emergency responders, and had no patience for what he saw as bureaucratic oversight disguised as technical evaluation. "Great! Another desk jockey coming along to count our supplies and complain about our methods," he'd announced loudly when Captain Harrison introduced Elena to the crew. "Hope you've got a strong stomach for real medicine, not the sanitized version they teach in equipment manuals." Elena had simply nodded, taken her assigned seat, and begun her quiet observations. She documented equipment function, noted response times, and filed technical reports that praised the crew's efficiency while recommending minor equipment upgrades. She spoke only when spoken to, asked no questions about medical procedures, and made no suggestions about patient care. By every measure, she was exactly what Captain Harrison had requested, an unobtrusive technical observer. But Marcus seemed to interpret her quiet competence as a challenge to his authority. During their second shift together, he'd begun what would become a months-long campaign of subtle intimidation, designed to make her request a transfer to different crews. When Elena remained in the ambulance during a cardiac arrest call, Marcus emerged afterward and commented loudly about civilians who were too squeamish to watch real medicine. When she efficiently helped load equipment, he criticized her technique in front of the other crew members. When she correctly identified a malfunctioning monitor before they'd noticed the problem, he dismissed her observation as getting lucky with obvious equipment failures. The dynamic reminded Elena of her surgical residency years, when established doctors would test new residents through criticism and deliberate challenges. But she was no longer Dr. Rodriguez fighting for her place in a competitive medical hierarchy. She was Elena Rodriguez, equipment technician, and she had no interest in proving her medical knowledge to Marcus Thompson or anyone else. Her strategy was simple: complete her contracted evaluation period, file her reports, and return to the predictable safety of her hospital maintenance routine. What Elena couldn't have predicted was how Marcus's behavior would escalate as her quiet competence continued to threaten his carefully constructed image. During a particularly challenging trauma call involving a motorcycle accident, Elena had instinctively stepped forward when the primary IV line failed, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to establish an alternative access point while Marcus fumbled with tangled equipment. The patient's condition stabilized, the call ended successfully, but Marcus had watched Elena's movements with growing suspicion. "Interesting technique for an equipment tech," he'd said afterward, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested he was beginning to piece together inconsistencies in Elena's background. Most maintenance people wouldn't know where to find a vein, let alone establish IV access that smooth. Elena had simply shrugged, offering an explanation about basic medical training being common in technical roles. But she'd seen the calculating look in Marcus's eyes and recognized that her carefully maintained invisibility was beginning to crack. Marcus Thompson was not the kind of man who let questions go unanswered, especially when they touched on his professional territory. The crew dynamics at Station 7 revolved entirely around Marcus's personality and leadership style. Tyler Brooks, a younger paramedic eager to advance his career, had attached himself to Marcus like a devoted apprentice, echoing his opinions and amplifying his criticisms. The EMTs, Nicole Davis and Robert Chen, maintained professional courtesy toward Elena, but made no effort to challenge the subtle hostility that Marcus directed her way. Captain Harrison visited the station only occasionally, and his interactions with the crew focused on operational matters rather than interpersonal dynamics. Elena found herself occupying an increasingly uncomfortable middle ground. Her technical reports were valued by the administrative side of Phoenix Metro EMS, leading to equipment improvements and operational efficiencies that saved both time and money. But her presence on Marcus's crew had become a source of tension that seemed to intensify with each shift. She began to recognize the signs of a workplace dynamic that was slowly but inevitably moving toward confrontation. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine medical transport. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. An elderly woman experiencing chest pain needed transport from a suburban clinic to Scottsdale Memorial for cardiac evaluation. The call was straightforward, requiring basic monitoring and supportive care during a 20-minute transport. Elena settled into her usual position, clipboard ready to document equipment performance during what she expected to be an unremarkable ride. But 5 minutes into the transport, the patient's condition deteriorated rapidly. What had appeared to be stable angina suddenly progressed to a massive cardiac event. The woman went into ventricular fibrillation, her heart's electrical system completely chaotic. Marcus immediately began CPR while Tyler prepared the defibrillator. But their first shock failed to restore normal rhythm. A second shock also failed. The patient was dying in their hands while Elena watched from her corner, her medical knowledge screaming at her to intervene while her personal boundaries held her rigidly in place. "Come on!" Marcus shouted, sweat beading on his forehead as he continued chest compressions. "Tyler, check the leads." Something's not connecting right. Elena could see the problem immediately. The defibrillator pads were positioned correctly, but the gel contact was insufficient due to the patient's dry skin. A simple adjustment would solve the issue, but she forced herself to remain silent. This wasn't her patient, wasn't her responsibility, and wasn't her role. She was an observer, nothing more. The third shock failed. The patient remained in ventricular fibrillation. Marcus was beginning to panic, his usual confidence cracking under pressure. "Why isn't this working? The equipment was fine this morning." Elena's hands clenched into fists as she watched the monitor display erratic rhythms that she could interpret with frightening clarity. Every instinct trained into her during years of surgical residency and trauma surgery screamed at her to act. She knew exactly what needed to be done, could see the solution as clearly as if it were written in textbook diagrams. But she also knew that stepping forward would shatter the carefully constructed boundaries that had protected her emotional stability for 4 years. The patient was dying while Elena wrestled with demons that went far beyond this single moment in this single ambulance. Tyler fumbled with the defibrillator settings, his inexperience showing under the pressure of a deteriorating situation. "Marcus, I think maybe the joules are wrong. Should I increase them?" "No!" Marcus snapped, his composure completely gone now. "Stay at standard protocol." The equipment must be malfunctioning. Elena bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The problem was technique, not technology. But acknowledging that meant acknowledging her ability to recognize the difference, which meant acknowledging medical knowledge that extended far beyond her claimed background as an equipment technician. The monitor alarm changed tone, indicating that the patient had been in ventricular fibrillation for over 4 minutes. Brain damage was becoming inevitable. Death was approaching with mathematical certainty. Marcus looked around the ambulance wildly, his gaze finally settling on Elena with desperation, replacing his usual hostility. "Your equipment evaluation. Is something wrong with the defibrillator? Give me something." For the first time in 4 years, Elena Rodriguez faced a moment where her personal boundaries collided directly with someone else's survival. She could maintain her emotional safety and watch the woman die, or she could step forward and risk everything she'd built to protect herself from the crushing weight of medical responsibility. The choice, when it came, felt less like a decision than like stepping off a cliff. "The gel contact isn't sufficient," she said quietly, her voice cutting through Marcus's panic like a scalpel through skin. "The pads need repositioning and fresh gel. Her skin is too dry for proper electrical conduction." Marcus stared at her for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Then his training overrode his ego, and he followed her instructions. Fresh gel, reposition pads, another shock. The monitor immediately shifted to a normal sinus rhythm. The patient's pulse returned strong and steady. The ambulance completed its journey to Scottsdale Memorial in tense silence. The patient was successfully transferred to the cardiac unit, where she would make a full recovery. Marcus completed his paperwork without comment, but Elena could feel his eyes on her throughout the process, calculating and suspicious. As they returned to Station 7, Marcus finally broke the silence. "That was quite a diagnosis for an equipment technician," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Almost like you've seen defibrillation problems before." Elena met his gaze steadily, recognizing that this moment marked the end of her invisibility. "Basic medical training covers electrical therapy principles," she replied, knowing the explanation sounded hollow even as she offered it. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Right. Basic training. Elena realized that she just crossed a line from which there might be no return. Marcus Thompson now knew that she possessed medical knowledge that extended far beyond her claimed background, and his personality virtually guaranteed that he wouldn't let the matter rest. Her carefully constructed world of emotional safety and professional anonymity was beginning to crumble. Over the following weeks, Marcus's behavior toward Elena shifted from dismissive hostility to active investigation. He began asking pointed questions about her background, testing her knowledge during equipment checks, and watching her reactions during medical calls with the intensity of a detective pursuing a suspect. The rest of the crew noticed the change in dynamic, though none understood its significance. Elena found herself trapped between conflicting pressures. Her medical knowledge had proven valuable during several subsequent calls, helping to identify equipment issues and suggesting solutions that improved patient outcomes. But each demonstration of competence deepened Marcus's suspicion and increased the risk that her true background would be exposed. She was walking a tightrope between maintaining her cover and allowing her skills to help save lives. The situation was becoming unsustainable, but Elena couldn't bring herself to request a transfer or abandon the evaluation program. Something about being back in an ambulance, even as an observer, was reawakening parts of herself that she'd thought were permanently buried. The familiar rhythm of emergency calls, the satisfaction of equipment functioning perfectly when lives depended on it, the team dynamics of crisis response, all of it resonated with aspects of her identity that extended far beyond her surgical background. For the first time in 4 years, Elena Rodriguez was beginning to remember who she'd been before the incident that ended her surgical career. But remembering also meant confronting the reasons she'd walked away from medicine in the first place. And those reasons remained as painful and complicated as ever. The tension reached a crescendo during a late-night shift, when Marcus deliberately assigned Elena to monitor a complex trauma call involving multiple victims from a construction accident. Instead of remaining in the ambulance, he insisted she accompany the crew into the scene to evaluate equipment performance under field conditions. Elena found herself standing in the middle of controlled chaos, surrounded by injured workers, while Marcus watched her reactions with predatory attention. When one of the victims went into shock, Elena instinctively stepped forward, her hands moving toward the patient before she caught herself and stepped back. But Marcus had seen the movement, had watched her body language shift from observer to responder before she'd reasserted control. "Interesting reaction," he commented later, his voice carrying unmistakable satisfaction. "Almost like you wanted to jump in and take over patient care." Elena realized that Marcus was systematically building a case against her, collecting evidence of medical knowledge and instinctive responses that contradicted her claimed background. The game they were playing was approaching its endgame, and Elena wasn't certain she could continue maintaining her cover much longer. But she also wasn't certain she wanted to. Something about the past few months had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with medicine in the first place. The intellectual challenge, the immediate impact, the profound satisfaction of using knowledge and skill to preserve life. All of it was calling to parts of herself that she'd tried to silence but never successfully eliminated. Elena Rodriguez was beginning to face a fundamental question about her identity and her future. She could continue hiding, maintain her emotional safety, and accept the limitations of a life built around avoidance. Or she could risk everything by stepping back into the world that had once defined her, knowing that doing so meant confronting both the reasons she'd left and the possibility that she might not be strong enough to handle the pressure again. The choice was approaching with the inexorability of a trauma call rushing through Phoenix traffic, and Elena was running out of time to decide who she really wanted to be. The monsoon rains had turned Phoenix into a sprawling mirror of wet asphalt and neon reflections, when Elena's carefully constructed world finally began to unravel completely. It started with a phone call that came during her lunch break at Scottsdale Memorial, the kind of call that transforms an ordinary Tuesday into a day you remember for the rest of your life. "Elena Rodriguez?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and somehow familiar. "This is Dr. Patricia Henley from Johns Hopkins. I believe we need to talk." Elena's sandwich turned to cardboard in her mouth. Dr. Henley had been her department chief during her surgical residency, the woman who'd championed Elena's rapid advancement through the program and who'd been devastated when Elena disappeared from medicine without explanation. Hearing her voice again was like having a door to the past suddenly blow open in a windstorm. "Dr. Henley," Elena managed, her voice carefully neutral despite the emotional earthquake happening in her chest. "I'm surprised to hear from you." "I imagine you are." "I received an interesting phone call yesterday from a paramedic in Phoenix, a Marcus Thompson. He had some very specific questions about a former trauma surgeon who might be working in Arizona under circumstances that seemed unusual. When he described the surgical knowledge demonstrated by an equipment technician named Elena Rodriguez, I began to put pieces together." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed anonymity crumbling around her. Marcus had done exactly what she'd feared he would do. He'd investigated, he'd dug deeper, and now her past was colliding with her present in ways that threatened everything she'd built. "Dr. Henley, I can explain. I'm not calling to criticize or judge, Elena. I'm calling because that same paramedic described medical interventions that saved 3 lives over the past month. Techniques that went far beyond basic first aid. If you're out there using your skills to help people, then maybe it's time we had a conversation about why you disappeared and whether there might be a path back." The conversation lasted 20 minutes and left Elena feeling like she'd been turned inside out. Dr. Henley was flying to Phoenix the following week for a medical conference and suggested they meet for coffee. No pressure, no agenda, just a conversation between colleagues who'd once worked closely together. But Elena knew that accepting the meeting would mean acknowledging her true identity, not just to Dr. Henley but to herself. More immediately, it meant that Marcus Thompson now had confirmation of his suspicions. Elena realized that her next shift at Station 7 would be unlike any she'd experienced before. She was right. When Elena arrived for her Thursday evening shift, the atmosphere at Station 7 felt electric with anticipation. Marcus was waiting for her in the equipment bay, his usual crew arranged around him like an audience prepared for a performance. Tyler Brooks wore a smirk that suggested he was in on whatever Marcus had planned. Even Nicole Davis, who'd always maintained professional courtesy toward Elena, seemed nervous and uncertain. "Well, well," Marcus said as Elena approached with her equipment evaluation clipboard. "Look who's joined us. Or should I say, look who's been hiding among us all this time, Dr. Rodriguez." Elena felt every eye in the station focus on her with laser intensity. The moment she'd been dreading for months had finally arrived. Her cover was blown, her identity exposed, and there was no script for how to handle the situation that was unfolding. "I prefer Elena," she said simply, setting down her clipboard with steady hands despite the chaos in her mind. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, I bet you do. I bet you prefer a lot of things about your current situation. Like letting real paramedics do the work while you sit back and critique our methods. Like hiding your qualifications while watching us struggle through calls you could handle in your sleep. Like playing innocent little equipment tech while you're actually one of the most highly trained trauma surgeons in the country." Elena could feel the weight of judgment settling around her like a physical presence. Tyler was recording the conversation on his phone, probably planning to share it with the broader EMS community. Nicole looked confused and hurt, as if Elena's deception had been a personal betrayal. The other crew members watched, with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. "My qualifications don't change my role here," Elena said, struggling to maintain the calm professionalism that had protected her for so long. "I'm here to evaluate equipment performance, nothing more." "Nothing more?" Marcus's voice rose with indignation. "You let us fumble through that cardiac arrest last month when you could have fixed the problem in seconds. You watched me struggle with that defibrillation when you knew exactly what was wrong. You sat there like a judge, evaluating our performance when you had the knowledge to save lives more efficiently." The accusation hit Elena harder than she'd expected because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. She had watched situations unfold when she could have intervened more quickly. She had maintained her observer role even when her surgical experience could have improved outcomes. The guilt she'd been carrying about her deception suddenly felt heavier when framed as a betrayal of the patients they'd served. "I was following my assigned role," Elena replied, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Tyler stepped forward, emboldened by Marcus's aggressive tone. "So what's the story, Doc? Why's a hotshot surgeon slumming it with us lowly paramedics? What'd you do, lose your license? Malpractice suit? Or maybe you just couldn't handle the pressure of real medicine? The questions struck like physical blows, each one targeting insecurities and fears that Elena had spent years trying to manage. The truth about why she'd left surgery was complicated, personal, and painful in ways that she'd never been able to fully articulate. But standing in that equipment bay, surrounded by hostile faces and confrontational energy, she realized that her carefully maintained silence had become its own form of dishonesty. "I left surgery because I lost a patient," Elena said quietly, the words feeling strange and sharp in her mouth. "A child. During a routine procedure that should have been straightforward. Equipment failure led to complications that I couldn't control. She died on my table, and her family blamed me for not doing more. The hospital review cleared me of any wrongdoing, but I couldn't clear myself." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Elena had never spoken those words aloud to anyone, had barely been able to think them without feeling the familiar spiral of guilt and self-doubt that had driven her away from surgery in the first place. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, his aggression tempered by unexpected sympathy. But Tyler wasn't ready to let go of his attack. "So you ran away? Abandoned your patients and your responsibilities because one case went bad? That's not very heroic, Doc." Elena felt something snap inside her chest, a tension that had been building for months, suddenly releasing with the force of a broken spring. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the equipment bay like a scalpel. "You think losing a patient is just a statistical inevitability that you brush off and move on from. You think watching a 7-year-old girl die because equipment failed during a procedure you've performed hundreds of times is something you just get over?" The room fell silent, Elena's pain and anger filling the space like a living thing. Tyler stepped back, his smugness replaced by uncertainty. Even Marcus seemed taken aback by the raw emotion in Elena's voice. "I didn't run away," Elena continued, her composure cracking after years of careful control. "I stepped back because I realized that carrying the weight of life-and-death decisions every day was destroying me. Because I understood that being technically competent wasn't enough if I couldn't handle the emotional toll of inevitable losses. Because I chose to find a way to contribute to medicine without putting myself in a position where another family would blame me for failing to save someone they loved." Nicole Davis spoke for the first time since Elena's arrival, her voice soft but clear. "That's why you always stay back during calls. You're protecting yourself from having to make those decisions again." Elena nodded, grateful for someone who seemed to understand the complexity of her situation. "I found a way to use my medical knowledge without carrying the responsibility for outcomes. Equipment evaluation lets me contribute to patient care indirectly. When the machines work properly, lives are saved. When they fail, it's not because I made the wrong decision in a critical moment." Marcus studied Elena with new intensity, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been respect. "But you've been intervening anyway. The IV access, the defibrillation problems, the equipment adjustments that improved patient outcomes. You've been making medical decisions whether you admit it or not." The observation was accurate in ways that Elena hadn't fully acknowledged, even to herself. Over the past months, she had gradually been drawn back into direct patient care despite her careful boundaries. Each intervention had felt necessary in the moment, but collectively they represented a pattern of re-engagement with the medical decision-making she'd tried to avoid. "Maybe," Elena admitted, "but those were technical corrections, not surgical decisions." "Were they?" Marcus challenged. "When you guided that IV placement during the motorcycle accident, you were making a clinical decision about vascular access under pressure. When you diagnosed the defibrillation problem, you were interpreting cardiac rhythms and electrical therapy responses. Those aren't equipment evaluations, Elena. That's emergency medicine." Elena realized that Marcus was forcing her to confront something she'd been avoiding for months. Despite her efforts to maintain strict boundaries, she'd been gradually returning to medical practice through the back door of technical consultation. Her surgical instincts had been reasserting themselves in small ways that had accumulated into a significant pattern of clinical involvement. The station alarm suddenly pierced the tension, its harsh electronic voice announcing a Priority 1 call. "Multiple vehicle accident on Interstate 17, Several casualties reported, all available units requested to respond. The personal confrontation was instantly suspended as professional training took over. Marcus grabbed his gear, his demeanor shifting back to focused competence. "This conversation isn't over," he told Elena, "but right now, we have a job to do." He paused at the ambulance door, looking back at her with an expression that mixed challenge and invitation. "You coming, Doc? Or are you planning to evaluate equipment performance from the station?" Elena stood frozen for a moment, recognizing that her response would define everything that followed. She could stay behind, maintain her boundaries, and preserve the emotional distance that had protected her for 4 years. Or she could climb into that ambulance and accept that her carefully constructed world of limited responsibility was already crumbling whether she acknowledged it or not. The sound of sirens starting up made the decision for her. Elena grabbed her evaluation kit and followed Marcus into the ambulance, knowing that she was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The accident scene was chaos organized around the mathematical precision of emergency response protocols. 3 vehicles had collided during rush-hour traffic, leaving wreckage scattered across 2 lanes of interstate highway. Fire rescue teams worked to extract trapped victims, while police managed traffic flow and paramedic crews triaged casualties according to severity and survivability. Elena found herself assigned to the least critical victims, documenting equipment performance while Marcus and Tyler handled the most severe trauma cases. But as she worked, she could see problems developing that her surgical training allowed her to recognize before they became obvious to others. The middle-aged woman Elena was monitoring appeared stable, conscious, and alert, with what seemed like minor injuries from her seatbelt and airbag deployment. But Elena noticed subtle signs that suggested internal complications. The woman's pain patterns, her skin coloration, and her blood pressure trends indicated possible abdominal bleeding that hadn't yet reached critical levels. Elena documented her observations in her equipment notes, trying to maintain her technical role while highlighting medical concerns that went beyond machine performance. But as she worked, she could see the woman's condition gradually deteriorating in ways that would become obvious to the paramedic crew only when intervention became more difficult. The internal debate that had been building for months reached a crescendo as Elena watched a preventable emergency developing in real time. She could maintain her boundaries and hope that Marcus would recognize the signs before the situation became critical. Or she could step forward and risk exposing herself to exactly the kind of medical responsibility she'd spent years avoiding. When the woman's blood pressure dropped suddenly and her level of consciousness began to change, Elena made her choice. "Marcus," she called across the accident scene, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in medical emergencies. "I need you to reassess patient 3. She's showing signs of internal bleeding that's progressing towards shock." Marcus looked up from his current patient, irritation flashing across his features. "She's stable. Minor injuries only." "Look at her skin color," Elena insisted, stepping closer to the woman's stretcher. "Pallor and diaphoresis despite normal ambient temperature. Blood pressure trending downward over the past 15 minutes. Abdominal guarding that's becoming more pronounced. She's bleeding internally, probably from spleen or liver laceration." Marcus studied the woman more carefully, his practiced eye beginning to pick up the subtle signs that Elena had recognized earlier. "How did you catch that?" he asked, his professional curiosity overriding his personal antagonism. "Pattern recognition," Elena replied, kneeling beside the stretcher to perform a more detailed assessment. "These symptoms develop gradually, but they follow predictable progressions when you know what to look for." As if to confirm Elena's diagnosis, the woman's blood pressure dropped again and she became disoriented and confused. Marcus immediately began emergency protocols for hemorrhagic shock while calling for priority transport to the trauma center. "Good catch," he admitted grudgingly as they loaded the patient into the ambulance. "If we'd waited another 20 minutes to recognize that bleeding, she might not have made it." Elena nodded, but her satisfaction at the successful diagnosis was tempered by the realization that she'd just crossed another line in her gradual return to active medical practice. She was no longer just evaluating equipment or offering technical suggestions. She was making clinical assessments and diagnostic decisions that directly impacted patient care. The transport to Scottsdale Memorial passed in tense silence as Marcus and Tyler worked to stabilize their patient, while Elena monitored vital signs and equipment function. But she could feel both men watching her. evaluating her responses and trying to understand the contradiction between her claimed role and her obvious capabilities. As they transferred the patient to the emergency department, Elena found herself speaking directly with the receiving trauma team, providing a concise medical summary that went far beyond equipment performance evaluation. The ED physicians accepted her report with the automatic respect accorded to experienced medical professionals, clearly recognizing her expertise despite her non-medical uniform. Marcus watched the interaction with fascination and growing suspicion. After the patient was safely transferred, he confronted Elena in the hospital corridor with questions that cut straight to the heart of her internal contradictions. "That wasn't equipment evaluation back there," he said bluntly. "That was clinical assessment at a level that takes years of training to develop. You diagnosed internal bleeding before it became obvious to experienced paramedics. You communicated with the trauma team like someone who speaks their language fluently. And you did it all while claiming to be just a technical observer." Elena realized that she'd reached a point where continued deception was impossible. Her medical knowledge and instincts had been reasserting themselves despite her efforts to suppress them, and Marcus had witnessed enough inconsistencies to make denial pointless. "You're right," she said simply. "I am more than just an equipment technician." "How much more?" Marcus pressed. "What's your actual background? How much medical training are we talking about?" Elena looked around the hospital corridor, seeing familiar faces among the medical staff and recognizing the institutional rhythms that had once defined her daily life. Standing there in her maintenance uniform while surrounded by the world she'd abandoned felt surreal, like being a ghost haunting her former existence. "I completed surgical residency at Johns Hopkins," Elena said quietly. "Trauma surgery specialty. I practiced for 3 years before I left medicine." Marcus stared at her, as if she'd just claimed to be a former astronaut. "Trauma surgery? You're a board-certified surgeon working as an equipment tech?" "Former surgeon," Elena corrected. "I don't practice anymore." Tyler, who'd been listening to the conversation with growing amazement, suddenly spoke up. "Wait a minute. Johns Hopkins trauma surgery. Elena Rodriguez. Holy hell, you're the Dr. Rodriguez. The one who pioneered those minimally invasive techniques for abdominal trauma. I read about your work in paramedic school." Elena felt the last remnants of her anonymity crumbling away. Tyler's recognition meant that her reputation in the medical community would make complete concealment impossible. Word would spread through Phoenix EMS within days, and her carefully constructed life of limited responsibility would be permanently disrupted. "That was a long time ago," Elena said, trying to minimize the significance of her former achievements. 3 years isn't that long," Marcus countered. "Those techniques are still considered cutting edge. Trauma surgeons across the country are trying to replicate your procedures." Elena realized that her former colleagues' respect for her work was making her current situation even more complicated. She'd walked away from a surgical career that was just beginning to reach its potential, abandoning research and clinical innovations that could have advanced the field significantly. "I had reasons for leaving," Elena said, her voice carrying finality that discouraged further questions. Marcus studied her with new understanding, his antagonism beginning to shift towards something more complex. "The patient you mentioned. The child who died. That's why you left surgery?" Elena nodded, feeling the familiar weight of guilt and loss that had driven her away from medicine. "I couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Every patient became a potential failure. Every procedure a chance to lose someone else. I found a way to contribute to healthcare without carrying that burden." Nicole Davis, who'd been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke. "But you've been carrying it anyway, haven't you? Every call we've run together, every patient we've treated, you've been making medical decisions whether you admit it or not. You've just been doing it indirectly." The observation hit Elena with unexpected force because it articulated something she'd been feeling but couldn't quite name. Despite her efforts to avoid medical responsibility, she'd been gradually drawn back into clinical decision-making through her technical role. Her surgical instincts had been reasserting themselves in small ways that had accumulated into significant medical involvement. "Maybe," Elena admitted. "But that's different from being responsible for surgical outcomes." "Is it?" Marcus challenged. "When you diagnosed that internal bleeding tonight, you made a decision that saved that woman's life. If you'd stayed silent and maintained your observer role, she might have died. That seems like surgical-level responsibility to me. Elena realized that Marcus was forcing her to confront the central contradiction in her carefully constructed post-surgical life. She'd tried to find a way to use her medical knowledge without accepting medical responsibility, but the two were proving impossible to separate in practice. The conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone, buzzing with a text message. Dr. Patricia Henley confirming their coffee meeting for Saturday morning. The past was calling, the present was crumbling, and Elena was running out of ways to avoid deciding who she really wanted to be. As they returned to Station 7, Elena knew that everything had changed. Her identity was exposed, her capabilities were known, and her carefully maintained boundaries were dissolving whether she wanted them to or not. The question was no longer whether she could continue hiding her surgical background, but whether she was ready to confront what it meant to be Dr. Elena Rodriguez again. The coffee meeting with Dr. Patricia Henley took place at a small cafe in Old Town Scottsdale, far from the medical district, where Elena might encounter colleagues from her current life. Henley arrived precisely on time, her silver hair and confident bearing making her instantly recognizable despite the years that had passed since their last meeting. She embraced Elena warmly as if no time had elapsed since their final conversation at Johns Hopkins. "You look well," Henley said, settling into a corner booth with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to conducting important conversations in public spaces. "Different than I expected, but well." Elena managed to smile, though she felt anything but composed. The past week since Marcus had exposed her identity had been a whirlwind of whispered conversations, curious stares, and uncomfortable questions from colleagues throughout Phoenix EMS. Her carefully constructed anonymity was completely shattered, and she was struggling to navigate the aftermath. "Thank you for coming all this way," Elena said, genuinely grateful, despite her nervousness. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after the way I disappeared." Henley waved dismissively. "You were one of my most promising residents. When you vanished without explanation, I spent months wondering if I'd failed you somehow. Learning that you're alive and apparently still practicing medicine, even in unconventional ways, is a relief." Elena felt the familiar knot of guilt tightening in her chest. Henley's concern and continued support made her abrupt departure from surgery feel even more like a betrayal of the people who had invested in her development. "I wasn't practicing medicine," Elena protested weakly. "I was evaluating equipment." Henley's expression suggested she found this distinction unconvincing. "According to Mr. Thompson's description, you've been making clinical assessments and diagnostic decisions that have directly impacted patient outcomes. That sounds like medical practice to me, regardless of your job title." Elena realized that her former mentor was approaching this conversation with the same analytical precision that had made her such an effective department chief. Henley had clearly done her research, spoken with Marcus extensively, and formed her own conclusions about Elena's current situation. "I've been careful to stay within appropriate boundaries," Elena said, though the words sounded hollow even to her. "Have you?" Henley challenged gently. "Or have you been trying to practice medicine while avoiding the emotional responsibility that comes with it? Because from what I've heard, you've been making medical decisions anyway. You've just been doing it indirectly." The observation echoed conversations Elena had been having with herself since Marcus confronted her at the accident scene. Despite her efforts to avoid medical responsibility, she'd been gradually drawn back into clinical decision-making through her technical role. Her surgical instincts had been reasserting themselves whether she acknowledged it or not. "The situation is complicated," Elena said, struggling to articulate feelings she'd never fully examined. "I left surgery because I couldn't handle the pressure of life-and-death decisions. Working in equipment evaluation allowed me to contribute to patient care without carrying that burden." Henley studied Elena with the penetrating gaze that had made her such an effective teacher and mentor. "Tell me about the patient you lost, the one that drove you away from surgery." Elena felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. She'd never discussed the details of Sarah Chen's death with anyone, had barely been able to think about the case without feeling overwhelmed by guilt and self-doubt. But sitting across from her former mentor, surrounded by the comfortable anonymity of a coffee shop, she found herself wanting to finally speak the words she'd been carrying alone for 4 years. "Her name was Sarah Chen," Elena began, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 years old. Routine appendectomy that should have been straightforward. But the laparoscopic equipment malfunctioned during the procedure. CO2 insufflation system failed, creating surgical complications that turned a simple operation into a life-threatening emergency. Henley listened without interruption, her expression neutral but attentive. Elena continued, the words coming easier now that she'd started. I converted to open surgery immediately, but the delay caused by the equipment failure led to complications: bowel perforation, sepsis, cardiac arrest. I fought for 3 hours to save her, tried every technique I knew, but she died on the table. The hospital review determined that the equipment failure was unforeseeable and that my response was appropriate. But her parents blamed me for not doing more, for not somehow overcoming the mechanical problems. Elena paused, remembering the devastation in the Chen family's eyes when she'd emerged from the operating room with the news that their daughter was gone. The father's accusation that she should have found a way to save Sarah despite the equipment failure. The mother's collapse into inconsolable grief that seemed to echo Elena's own sense of professional failure. The technical investigation showed that the equipment had experienced a cascade failure that affected multiple systems simultaneously, Elena continued. It was the kind of mechanical problem that occurs maybe once in 10,000 procedures, but knowing that didn't change the fact that I couldn't save her when her family was counting on me. Henley reached across the table and touched Elena's hand gently. Equipment failure during surgery is every surgeon's nightmare. You did everything possible under impossible circumstances. Did I? Elena asked, voicing the doubt that had haunted her for years. Or could I have done something different, something better? Could I have recognized the problem sooner, compensated more effectively, found some alternative approach that would have saved her? Henley's expression softened with understanding. You're describing survivor's guilt combined with perfectionist tendencies that are common among high-achieving surgeons. The need to believe that every outcome is controllable, that perfect technique can overcome any obstacle. Elena nodded, recognizing the psychological patterns that Henley was describing. I realized that I couldn't continue practicing surgery while carrying that level of self-doubt. Every patient became a potential failure, every procedure a chance to lose someone else. I found a way to contribute to healthcare without accepting personal responsibility for outcomes. But you haven't actually avoided responsibility, Henley observed. You've just been exercising it indirectly. When you diagnosed internal bleeding in that accident victim, you made a clinical decision that saved a life. If you'd remained silent, she might have died. That's the same level of responsibility you carried as a surgeon. Elena realized that her former mentor was articulating something she'd been feeling but couldn't quite name. Despite her efforts to avoid medical responsibility, she'd been gradually drawn back into clinical decision-making through her technical role. Her surgical instincts had been reasserting themselves in ways that carried the same emotional weight she'd tried to escape. Maybe, Elena admitted. But equipment evaluation feels different from surgery, less direct, less personal. Henley smiled with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping young doctors navigate complex professional challenges. Elena, you were one of the most gifted surgical residents I ever trained. Your technical skills were exceptional, but more importantly, you had the kind of clinical intuition that can't be taught. Watching you walk away from surgery was heartbreaking, not just professionally, but personally. Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Henley's continued belief in her capabilities was touching and painful in equal measure. I don't know if I can handle surgery again. The pressure, the responsibility, the possibility of losing patients despite doing everything right. Nobody's suggesting you return to surgery immediately, Henley said gently, but maybe there are intermediate steps that could help you rebuild confidence while using your skills to help people. Emergency medicine, trauma consultation, surgical education, ways to practice medicine that might feel less overwhelming than operating. Elena considered the suggestion, recognizing both its appeal and its dangers. The idea of returning to active medical practice was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Her work with Phoenix EMS had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with medicine in the first place, but it had also demonstrated that she couldn't maintain the emotional distance she'd thought would protect her. I've been thinking about that, Elena said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm ready for the full weight of medical responsibility again. Henley studied Elena with the analytical gaze that had made her such an effective mentor. What if I told you that there was a position that might interest you? A consulting role with the trauma surgery department at Arizona General. They're developing a new program for emergency surgical procedures in pre-hospital settings. Mobile surgical units, helicopter transport, advanced trauma care in ambulances. They need someone with your background and your recent experience with emergency medical services. Elena felt her pulse quicken, despite her carefully maintained reservations. The concept sounded like exactly the kind of innovative medical practice that had attracted her to surgery in the first place. Combining surgical expertise with emergency medicine, bringing operating room capabilities to patients who couldn't wait for transport to traditional facilities. That sounds incredibly challenging, Elena said, trying to keep her voice neutral despite her growing interest. It would be, Henley confirmed, but it would also be groundbreaking work that could save lives in situations where traditional surgical approaches aren't feasible. And it would allow you to use your skills in ways that might feel less overwhelming than conventional operating room practice. Elena realized that Henley was offering her a potential path back to surgery that addressed many of her concerns about traditional practice. Working in emergency settings would mean shorter, more focused procedures rather than lengthy operations where complications could develop over hours. The emphasis would be on immediate life-saving interventions rather than complex reconstructive work, where perfectionist tendencies could become paralyzing. "I'd need to think about it," Elena said, though she could feel her interest growing despite her efforts to maintain skepticism. "Of course," Henley replied. "But don't think too long. The program is moving forward, whether you're involved or not, and frankly, you're uniquely qualified for this kind of work. Your surgical training, combined with your recent experience in emergency medical services, makes you an ideal candidate." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Elena found her mind constantly returning to Henley's proposal. The idea of combining surgical expertise with emergency medicine appealed to parts of her identity that she'd tried to suppress, but never successfully eliminated. It represented a potential compromise between the emotional safety she'd sought and the medical challenges that still called to her. When they parted, Henley pressed a business card into Elena's hand. "Dr. Michael Santos at Arizona General. He's heading the mobile surgery program. I've already spoken with him about your background. He's very interested in meeting with you." Elena pocketed the card, knowing that accepting Henley's offer would mean abandoning the carefully constructed limitations that had protected her emotional stability for 4 years. But she also knew that her current situation was becoming untenable. Her identity was exposed. Her boundaries were dissolving, and she was being forced to confront questions about her future that she'd been avoiding. The next shift at Station 7 confirmed that Elena's professional life had been permanently altered by recent revelations. Marcus greeted her with a mixture of respect and curiosity that felt completely different from his previous hostility. Tyler Brooks, who had been researching Elena's surgical background online, peppered her with technical questions about trauma procedures. Even Nicole Davis treated her differently, seeking her opinion on medical calls rather than simply accepting her presence as an observer. "So what's the plan, Doc?" Marcus asked as they checked equipment before their shift. "You going back to surgery? Staying with EMS? Or are you planning to keep pretending you're just an equipment tech?" Elena realized that Marcus was asking the question she'd been avoiding since her conversation with Henley. Her current role was no longer sustainable, but she hadn't yet decided what should replace it. "I'm considering options," Elena said carefully. "Well, while you're considering, we could use your input on something," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he was about to propose something significant. "Captain Harrison has been talking about expanding our advanced life support capabilities. More sophisticated procedures, better equipment, maybe even some surgical interventions in extreme circumstances." Elena felt a familiar spark of interest, despite her reservations. "What kind of surgical interventions?" Tyler jumped into the conversation with obvious enthusiasm. "Emergency procedures that could save lives when transport time to trauma centers is too long. Stuff like emergency thoracotomies, basic laparotomies, maybe even some vascular repairs." Elena recognized the concept immediately. It was similar to the mobile surgery program that Henley had described, bringing operating room capabilities to patients in emergency settings. The idea was medically sound but technically challenging, requiring extensive training and specialized equipment. "That's ambitious," Elena said, trying to maintain professional objectivity despite her growing interest. "The training requirements alone would be significant. Paramedics would need surgical education that goes far beyond current certification standards." Marcus studied her with the calculating expression that had become familiar over recent weeks. "Unless we had someone with surgical experience to help develop the program, someone who understood both emergency medicine and operating room procedures. Elena realized that Marcus was essentially offering her the same kind of opportunity that Henley had presented, but from within the EMS system rather than through traditional hospital channels. The idea of helping to develop advanced emergency procedures appealed to her desire to contribute to innovative medical practice without returning to conventional surgery. "It's an interesting concept," Elena admitted, "but the regulatory challenges would be enormous. Paramedics performing surgical procedures outside hospital settings would require new certification standards, equipment protocols, legal frameworks." "Sounds like something that would need expert consultation," Marcus said meaningfully. "Someone with surgical training who understands emergency medicine operations." Elena found herself caught between competing visions of her professional future. Henley was offering a path back to surgery through trauma consultation and mobile operating units. Marcus was suggesting a role in developing advanced emergency procedures within the EMS system. Both options appealed to different aspects of her medical identity, but both also required her to abandon the emotional safety of limited responsibility. The decision was postponed by the station alarm announcing a Priority 1 call. Multi-vehicle accident, with entrapment, possible fatalities, all units requested to respond immediately. Elena climbed into the ambulance knowing that this call would test her ability to maintain boundaries that were already crumbling. The accident scene was devastation organized around the mechanical precision of emergency response. A semi-truck had collided with multiple passenger vehicles during morning rush hour, creating a debris field that stretched across 3 lanes of interstate highway. Fire rescue teams worked to extract victims trapped in crushed vehicles, while police managed traffic flow, and paramedic crews triaged casualties according to severity and survivability. Elena found herself assigned to the most critical victim, a young construction worker whose truck had been crushed against the concrete median barrier. He was conscious but trapped, with obvious chest trauma and possible spinal injuries. The extraction process would take at least 20 minutes, during which his condition could deteriorate rapidly. As Elena worked to monitor his vital signs and maintain airway patency, she recognized signs that suggested developing tension pneumothorax. Air was accumulating in his chest cavity, compressing his lungs and heart, creating a life-threatening emergency that would only worsen as rescue teams worked to free him from the wreckage. Elena found herself facing exactly the kind of medical crisis that her surgical training had prepared her to handle. She could see the problem developing, understood the progression of symptoms, and knew exactly what intervention was needed. But providing that intervention would mean crossing the line from observer to active medical practitioner in the most dramatic way possible. "Marcus," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in medical emergencies. "I need you to assess this patient for tension pneumothorax. His breathing patterns and vital signs suggest air accumulation in the chest cavity." Marcus moved closer to examine the patient, his experienced eye picking up the subtle signs that Elena had recognized. "You're right. Breath sounds are diminished on the left side, and his blood pressure is starting to drop." Elena knew that the standard treatment for tension pneumothorax was immediate needle decompression, a procedure that involved inserting a large bore needle into the chest cavity to release trapped air. It was technically within paramedic scope of practice, but it required precise anatomical knowledge and steady hands under pressure. "He needs needle decompression," Elena said, watching Marcus prepare the necessary equipment. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, just above the third rib." Marcus positioned the needle carefully, but Elena could see his hesitation. The procedure was high risk, with the potential for serious complications if performed incorrectly. A misplaced needle could puncture the heart or major blood vessels, causing more damage than the original injury. "I've only done this a few times," Marcus admitted, his usual confidence shaken by the gravity of the situation. "And never in field conditions like this." Elena realized that she was facing a moment that would define everything that followed. She could maintain her observer role and hope that Marcus successfully performed a procedure he was clearly uncomfortable with. Or she could step forward and accept the medical responsibility she'd been avoiding for 4 years. The patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His blood pressure continued to drop, his breathing became more labored, and his level of consciousness was beginning to change. Without immediate intervention, he would die trapped in his crushed vehicle while rescue teams worked to free him. Elena made her choice. "Let me do it," she said, moving closer to the patient with the fluid confidence of someone who had performed the procedure dozens of times. "I have more experience with this technique." Marcus hesitated for a moment, recognizing that allowing Elena to perform the procedure would cross multiple professional and legal boundaries. She wasn't certified as a paramedic, had no official medical authority in this setting, and would be assuming full responsibility for the outcome. But the patient was dying, and Elena was clearly the most qualified person available to save him. Marcus handed her the needle and stepped back, creating space for Elena to work. "Do it!" Elena positioned herself beside the trapped patient, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. She palpated anatomical landmarks, identified the precise insertion point, and prepared to perform a procedure she hadn't attempted in 4 years. "Second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line," she murmured, more to herself than to Marcus. "Insert perpendicular to the chest wall. Advance until you feel the pop of the pleural membrane." Elena inserted the needle with practiced precision, feeling the subtle resistance and release that indicated proper placement. Immediately, trapped air began to escape through the needle with a distinctive hissing sound. The patient's breathing improved within seconds, his blood pressure stabilized, and his level of consciousness began to return to normal. The successful decompression drew attention from other emergency responders working the accident scene. Elena found herself surrounded by paramedics, firefighters, and police officers who had witnessed her perform a life-saving procedure with textbook precision under extremely challenging conditions. "Nice work," said Captain Harrison, who had arrived on scene to coordinate the multi-unit response. "That was perfect needle decompression technique. Where did you learn to do that?" Elena realized that she had just publicly demonstrated surgical skills in front of the entire Phoenix EMS command structure. Her anonymity was completely shattered, her capabilities were obvious to everyone present, and she had voluntarily assumed the kind of medical responsibility she'd been avoiding for years. "I have some medical background," Elena said carefully, though she knew the understatement was absurd given what people had just witnessed. Captain Harrison studied her with obvious interest. "Some medical background? That was advanced emergency medicine performed at expert level. We need to talk when this call is finished." Elena knew that her carefully constructed world of limited responsibility had just collapsed completely. She had crossed the line from observer to active medical practitioner in the most public way possible, and there was no returning to her previous role. The question was no longer whether she could continue hiding her surgical background, but what she was going to do with the skills she'd just demonstrated. As rescue teams finally freed the construction worker and loaded him into Elena's ambulance for transport, she realized that she was no longer running from her medical identity. Whether she was ready or not, Dr. Elena Rodriguez had returned to emergency medicine, and everyone around her now knew exactly who she was. The emergency department at Scottsdale Memorial was bustling with controlled chaos when Elena arrived with the construction worker whose life she'd saved through needle decompression. The trauma team was waiting, having been alerted by radio about the field procedure that had stabilized their incoming patient. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending emergency physician, greeted the ambulance crew with professional efficiency that shifted to curiosity when she recognized Elena among the paramedics. "Elena Rodriguez?" Dr. Walsh said, her voice carrying surprise and confusion. "What are you doing in an EMS uniform? I thought you worked in equipment maintenance." Elena felt the weight of multiple gazes focusing on her as medical staff throughout the emergency department began to notice the unusual situation. Word had already begun spreading through hospital communications about the equipment technician who had performed expert-level emergency medicine in the field. "It's complicated," Elena replied, helping to transfer the patient while avoiding detailed explanations that would only raise more questions. Dr. Walsh continued her assessment of the construction worker, noting the professional quality of the field treatment he'd received. Whoever performed this needle decompression did excellent work. Textbook placement, perfect timing, probably saved his life. Marcus stepped forward with obvious pride. "That would be our technical consultant here. Turns out she has some medical background we weren't aware of." Elena shot Marcus a warning look, but the damage was already done. Dr. Walsh studied Elena with renewed interest, clearly recognizing that something significant was being understated. The construction worker was wheeled away for further treatment, but Elena found herself surrounded by curious medical staff who had heard fragments of the story and wanted more details. "Medical background?" Dr. Walsh pressed. What kind of medical background allows an equipment tech to perform emergency thoracic procedures? Elena realized that her demonstration at the accident scene had created a situation where continued deception was impossible. Too many people had witnessed her skills, too many questions were being asked, and her carefully maintained anonymity was completely shattered. "I used to practice surgery," Elena said simply, hoping to satisfy curiosity without encouraging further discussion. The admission sent ripples of conversation through the emergency department as staff members tried to reconcile Elena's current role with her apparent surgical expertise. Dr. Walsh's expression shifted from curiosity to recognition as pieces began falling into place. "Surgery? What kind of surgery? Where did you train?" Elena felt trapped between competing pressures to maintain privacy about her past and to provide enough information to satisfy the growing crowd of questioners. "Trauma surgery. Johns Hopkins residency program." Dr. Walsh's eyes widened with recognition. "Elena Rodriguez. Johns Hopkins trauma surgery. You're the Dr. Rodriguez who developed those innovative laparoscopic techniques for abdominal injuries. Your research was groundbreaking. What are you doing working as an equipment technician?" Elena felt her carefully constructed world of anonymity crumbling completely. Her surgical reputation was following her into this new professional environment, creating expectations and pressures that she'd spent years trying to avoid. "I left surgery several years ago," Elena said, trying to minimize the significance of her background. "I found other ways to contribute to healthcare." Dr. Walsh looked at Elena as if she were speaking in a foreign language. "You left trauma surgery? Why would someone with your capabilities walk away from surgical practice?" The question hung in the air, drawing attention from everyone within hearing range. Elena could feel the weight of professional judgment settling around her as medical colleagues tried to understand why someone would abandon a successful surgical career for equipment maintenance work. "Personal reasons," Elena replied, hoping to end the discussion without providing details that would only generate more questions. Marcus, who had been observing the interaction with growing fascination, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. The captain wants to debrief about the field procedure anyway." Elena was grateful for Marcus's intervention, even though she suspected his motives were more about satisfying his own curiosity than protecting her privacy. They left the emergency department under the watchful eyes of medical staff who were clearly planning to investigate Elena's background further. Captain Harrison was waiting at Station 7 when they returned, his expression serious and purposeful. Elena recognized the look of someone who was preparing to have a conversation that would change everything that followed. "Ms. Rodriguez," Captain Harrison began, then paused and corrected himself. "Or should I say Dr. Rodriguez? I've been making some phone calls since your performance at the accident scene. Your reputation in the trauma surgery community is quite impressive." Elena settled into a chair across from Harrison's desk, knowing that this conversation would determine her future with Phoenix EMS. Her demonstration of surgical skills had crossed multiple professional boundaries, and there would be consequences regardless of the positive outcome. "I completed surgical training several years ago," Elena acknowledged, "but I'm not currently practicing medicine." Harrison studied her with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to making personnel decisions under complex circumstances. "Not currently practicing medicine? What would you call performing emergency thoracic procedures in the field?" That looked like medical practice to me. Elena realized that Harrison was forcing her to confront the contradictions in her carefully constructed professional identity. Despite her efforts to avoid medical responsibility, she'd been making clinical decisions and performing procedures that were clearly within the scope of surgical practice. "I was responding to an emergency situation," Elena said. "The patient needed immediate intervention. And you provided that intervention with expertise that goes far beyond your stated qualifications," Harrison replied, which raises questions about why someone with your background is working as an equipment evaluator when you could be practicing surgery. Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied discussions about her departure from surgery. Harrison's questions were reasonable from an administrative perspective, but they touched on personal issues that she'd never been able to fully resolve. "I had reasons for leaving surgical practice," Elena said carefully. "Equipment evaluation allowed me to contribute to patient care without the pressures of operative medicine." Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've been talking with Dr. Patricia Henley at Johns Hopkins. She speaks very highly of your capabilities and your potential. She also mentioned that you might be interested in consulting opportunities that combine surgical expertise with emergency medicine. Elena realized that Henley had been working behind the scenes to create opportunities for her return to medical practice. The conversation felt orchestrated, as if multiple parties were coordinating to push her toward decisions she wasn't ready to make. Dr. Henley mentioned some possibilities, Elena admitted. But I haven't made any commitments. Harrison smiled with the confidence of someone who was about to make an offer that would be difficult to refuse. What if I told you that Phoenix Metro EMS has been selected for a pilot program developing advanced emergency procedures for pre-hospital settings? We need someone with surgical training to help design protocols, train personnel, and supervise implementation. Elena felt her pulse quicken, despite her efforts to maintain professional skepticism. The concept aligned perfectly with her interests in both emergency medicine and surgical innovation, offering a potential path back to active medical practice without the overwhelming pressures of traditional operating room surgery. That sounds challenging, Elena said, trying to keep her voice neutral despite her growing interest. It would be, Harrison confirmed. We're talking about bringing surgical capabilities to patients who can't wait for transport to trauma centers. Emergency procedures performed in ambulances, helicopter medical units, even field hospitals in disaster situations. Elena recognized the revolutionary potential of what Harrison was describing. The ability to perform life-saving surgery in pre-hospital settings could dramatically improve outcomes for trauma patients, particularly in remote areas where transport times to major medical centers were prohibitive. The regulatory challenges would be enormous, Elena said, her analytical mind already working through the complexities involved. Paramedics performing surgical procedures would require extensive additional training, specialized equipment, new certification standards. Harrison nodded approvingly. Exactly the kind of challenges that would need expert guidance from someone with both surgical training and emergency medicine experience. Someone like you. Elena realized that Harrison was offering her the opportunity to shape the future of emergency medicine while using her surgical skills in innovative ways. The role would involve training, consultation, and protocol development rather than traditional operative surgery, potentially addressing her concerns about patient responsibility while allowing her to contribute meaningfully to medical advancement. I'd need to understand more about the program structure, Elena said, trying to maintain negotiating distance despite her obvious interest. Of course, Harrison replied. But first I need to address what happened today. You performed a medical procedure without current certification or legal authority within our system. Technically, that's a violation of multiple regulations. Elena felt her stomach drop as the legal implications of her actions became clear. She'd been so focused on saving the construction worker's life that she hadn't considered the administrative consequences of stepping outside her authorized role. I understand, Elena said quietly. I was trying to help, but I realize I overstepped boundaries. Harrison studied her for a moment before continuing. Fortunately, the patient survived because of your intervention. The medical outcome was excellent, your technique was flawless, and everyone involved agrees that you made the right decision under the circumstances. Elena felt a wave of relief, but Harrison's expression suggested that the conversation wasn't over. However, Harrison continued, we can't have personnel performing procedures outside their certification scope, regardless of their qualifications, which means we need to resolve your status within our system. Elena recognized that Harrison was presenting her with an ultimatum, disguised as an opportunity. She could either accept a role that utilized her medical training within appropriate legal frameworks, or she would need to leave the EMS system entirely. What are you proposing? Elena asked. Harrison pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be official documentation. Emergency medical consultant position with surgical specialization. You'd work directly with me to develop advanced procedure protocols, train selected personnel in surgical techniques, and provide expert guidance during complex calls. Elena examined the documents, recognizing both the opportunity and the trap they represented. Accepting the position would mean abandoning her carefully maintained distance from medical responsibility and returning to active healthcare practice. But refusing would mean losing the connection to emergency medicine that had been reawakening her passion for medical work. This would be full medical practice, Elena observed. Not equipment evaluation or technical consultation. Yes, Harrison confirmed. Which means you'd need to restore your medical license, complete any required continuing education, and accept full professional responsibility for your decisions and actions. Elena felt the weight of the choice settling around her like a physical presence. For 4 years, she'd been hiding from the pressures and responsibilities of medical practice, finding ways to contribute to healthcare without accepting the emotional burden of patient outcomes. Now she was being asked to step back into that world completely, with all the risks and rewards it entailed. "I need time to consider this," Elena said, though she could feel her resistance weakening as she contemplated the exciting possibilities Harrison was describing. "Take the time you need," Harrison replied. "But don't take too long. The pilot program launches in 6 weeks, and we need our consultant in place to begin developing protocols." Elena left Captain Harrison's office feeling like her life was spinning out of control in directions she hadn't anticipated. Every conversation, every choice, every demonstration of her capabilities was pushing her closer to a decision she'd been avoiding for years. The question was no longer whether she could continue hiding from her medical identity, but whether she was ready to embrace it again. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and increasingly public discussions about Elena's background and future. Dr. Henley called twice to discuss potential opportunities at Arizona General. Marcus and his crew treated her with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made her previous anonymity seem like a distant memory. Even her colleagues at Scottsdale Memorial began approaching her with questions about her surgical experience and her plans for returning to medical practice. Elena found herself at the center of attention she'd spent years trying to avoid, forced to confront questions about her identity and her professional future that she'd been successfully suppressing. The carefully constructed boundaries between her past and present were dissolving, leaving her exposed to both opportunities and pressures she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. The situation reached a crisis point during what should have been a routine equipment maintenance shift at the hospital. Elena was calibrating a new cardiac monitor when Dr. Michael Santos approached her with a confidence that suggested he'd been planning the conversation for some time. "Dr. Rodriguez?" Santos said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I'm Michael Santos, trauma surgery at Arizona General. Patricia Henley suggested we should meet." Elena shook his hand automatically, recognizing that another piece of her carefully constructed anonymity was about to crumble. Santos represented the mobile surgery program that Henley had described, the innovative medical practice that combined surgical expertise with emergency medicine in ways that appealed to her professional interests. "Dr. Santos," Elena replied carefully. "Dr. Henley mentioned your program." Santos studied her with obvious interest, clearly recognizing her reputation despite her current non-medical role. "I've been following your work since your Johns Hopkins days. Your techniques for minimally invasive trauma surgery were groundbreaking. We could use someone with your expertise." Elena felt the familiar pressure of professional expectations that she'd been trying to escape. Santos represented another path back to surgical practice, another opportunity to return to the medical career she'd abandoned, another choice that would require her to confront the reasons she'd walked away from surgery in the first place. "I'm not currently practicing surgery," Elena said, offering the same explanation she'd been giving to everyone who asked about her medical background. Santos smiled with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to recruiting talented physicians for challenging positions. "I know. That's actually one of the reasons you'd be perfect for our program. You have the surgical expertise we need, but you also have recent experience in emergency medical services. That combination is exactly what we're looking for." Elena realized that her time with Phoenix EMS, which she'd viewed as a retreat from medical practice, was actually being seen as valuable preparation for more advanced medical roles. Her unique background was making her an attractive candidate for opportunities she hadn't sought and wasn't sure she wanted. "The program sounds interesting," Elena said diplomatically, "but I'd need to understand more about what's involved." Santos pulled out a tablet computer and began showing Elena detailed presentations about the mobile surgery program. Emergency operating rooms built into specially equipped ambulances. Helicopter transport units capable of performing complex procedures during flight. Surgical teams trained to work in disaster zones and remote locations where traditional medical facilities weren't available. "This is the future of trauma surgery," Santos explained enthusiastically, taking operating room capabilities to patients instead of waiting for patients to reach operating rooms. "Your expertise would be instrumental in developing these programs." Elena found herself drawn into the technical details despite her reservations about returning to surgical practice. The innovative approach to emergency medicine appealed to her interest in medical advancement, while the non-traditional setting might address some of her concerns about the pressures of conventional surgery. The regulatory approval process must be incredibly complex, Elena observed, her analytical mind already working through the challenges involved in implementing such revolutionary medical practices. Enormously complex, Santos agreed, which is why we need someone with your background to help navigate the technical and legal requirements. Someone who understands both surgical procedures and emergency medicine operations. Elena realized that Santos was offering her the opportunity to shape the future of emergency surgery while avoiding some of the pressures that had driven her away from traditional medical practice. Working in mobile surgical units would involve shorter, more focused procedures rather than lengthy operations where complications could develop over hours. "I'd need time to consider this," Elena said, though she could feel her interest growing despite her efforts to maintain skepticism. "Of course," Santos replied, "but I hope you'll consider it seriously. This is groundbreaking work that could save thousands of lives. And frankly, you're uniquely qualified to help make it successful." Elena left the conversation feeling overwhelmed by the competing opportunities that were suddenly available to her. Captain Harrison wanted her to develop surgical protocols for Phoenix EMS. Dr. Henley was encouraging her to return to trauma surgery through consulting work. Dr. Santos was offering her a role in revolutionary mobile surgery programs. All of them recognized her expertise and wanted to utilize her skills in ways that would return her to active medical practice. The choices were exciting and terrifying in equal measure. Each opportunity offered the chance to use her surgical training in innovative ways that might address her concerns about traditional medical practice, but each also required her to abandon the emotional safety of limited responsibility and accept the full weight of medical decision-making that she'd been avoiding for 4 years. Elena realized that she was reaching a point where continued avoidance was becoming impossible. Her skills had been demonstrated publicly, her background was known throughout the medical community, and opportunities were presenting themselves that would require her to make definitive choices about her professional future. The question was no longer whether she could continue hiding from her medical identity, but whether she was ready to embrace the challenges and responsibilities that came with being Dr. Elena Rodriguez again. The decision she'd been postponing for 4 years was approaching with the inevitability of an emergency call rushing through Phoenix traffic, and she was running out of time to decide who she really wanted to be. The decision came in the form of a catastrophic construction accident on a scorching Phoenix afternoon. Elena was completing paperwork at Station 7 when the emergency call crackled through the radio with an urgency that made everyone in the station freeze. High-rise construction collapsed downtown. Multiple workers trapped under debris. Mass casualty incident with at least 12 victims requiring immediate transport. Marcus was already moving toward the ambulance before the dispatcher finished speaking. "This is going to be bad," he said, his usual bravado replaced by grim professionalism. "Elena, you coming with us or staying here?" Elena looked at her equipment evaluation clipboard, then at the ambulance that represented everything she'd been trying to avoid for 4 years. The choice felt symbolic. A final moment where she could either retreat to safety or step forward into the uncertainty of active medical practice. "I'm coming," she said, grabbing her emergency kit and following Marcus into the ambulance that would carry her toward the most challenging medical crisis of her career. The scene downtown was controlled chaos organized around the mathematical precision of disaster response. A 40-story building under construction had experienced a catastrophic failure of its temporary support structure, sending tons of concrete and steel crashing down onto workers who had been finishing the foundation level. Fire rescue teams worked frantically to extract victims from the debris, while paramedic crews triaged casualties according to severity and survivability. Elena found herself assigned to the most critical victim, a young foreman named David Martinez who had been partially crushed by falling concrete. His injuries were devastating. Massive internal bleeding, possible spinal damage, and trauma so severe that transport to the nearest trauma center would take precious time he didn't have. As Elena worked to stabilize Martinez for transport, she quickly realized that conventional emergency medicine wouldn't be sufficient. His abdominal cavity was filling with blood from multiple internal injuries, his blood pressure was dropping rapidly, and he was showing signs of hemorrhagic shock that would prove fatal long before they could reach surgical facilities. "We need to get him to Arizona General immediately," Marcus said, recognizing the gravity of the situation. Their trauma team is the best equipped to handle this level of injury. Elena checked Martinez's vital signs and felt her heart sink. Blood pressure was barely detectable, his pulse was weak and thready, and his level of consciousness was deteriorating rapidly. Even with lights and sirens, the transport to Arizona General would take at least 15 minutes through downtown traffic. Martinez didn't have 15 minutes. "He's not going to make it to the hospital," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had seen similar injuries too many times. "He needs surgical intervention now, or he's going to die in this ambulance." Marcus looked at her with desperation beginning to crack his professional composure. "What are you saying? We don't have surgical capabilities in the field. The best we can do is supportive care and hope he holds on during transport." Elena stared at Martinez's monitor, watching his vital signs spiral downward with mechanical precision. Every instinct developed during her surgical training was screaming at her to act, but doing so would mean crossing every boundary she'd established to protect herself from medical responsibility. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them, "I can save him, but I need to operate here, in this ambulance, while we're moving." Marcus stared at her as if she'd suggested performing brain surgery with kitchen utensils. "Operate? In a moving ambulance? That's impossible. You don't have proper equipment, sterile conditions, surgical support staff. It would be suicide." Elena knew that Marcus was right about the challenges, but she also knew that Martinez would die without immediate surgical intervention. His internal bleeding was too severe for conventional emergency treatment, and transport time to definitive care was too long for him to survive. "I can perform an emergency laparotomy to control the bleeding," Elena said, her surgical training taking over as she mentally cataloged the equipment available in the ambulance. "It's not ideal, but it's his only chance." Martinez's blood pressure dropped again, and his pulse became even weaker. The monitor alarm began its familiar warning tone, indicating that cardiac arrest was imminent. Elena realized that she had perhaps 2 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether this young man lived or died. Tyler Brooks, who had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "Elena, you're talking about performing surgery in the back of a moving ambulance with no surgical team, no proper equipment, and no backup if something goes wrong. That's not medicine, that's desperation." Elena looked at Tyler with the calm certainty of someone who had made impossible decisions under pressure many times before. "Sometimes desperation is all we have. Sometimes impossible is the only option left." She turned to Marcus with an expression that demanded an immediate answer. "I need you to make a choice. Let me try to save him, or watch him die while we argue about protocols and procedures. Which is it going to be?" Marcus studied Elena's face, recognizing the absolute confidence that came from years of surgical training and experience. Despite his reservations about the unprecedented nature of what she was proposing, he could see that she genuinely believed she could save Martinez's life. "What do you need?" Marcus asked, his decision made. Elena immediately began converting the ambulance into an improvised operating room. She had Tyler maintain manual ventilation while Marcus established additional IV access for fluid resuscitation. Using the ambulance's built-in equipment and supplies from their emergency kit, she assembled the basic tools necessary for emergency abdominal surgery. "This is insane," Tyler muttered, but he continued following Elena's instructions as she prepared for the most challenging procedure of her career. Elena used surgical preparation supplies to create as sterile a field as possible given the circumstances. The patient's abdomen was cleaned and draped using emergency blankets and antiseptic solutions. Her hands, despite being gloved with standard paramedic equipment rather than surgical gloves, were steady and confident as she prepared to make the first incision. "Martinez," she said softly to the semi-conscious patient, "I'm going to help you. Just hold on." Elena made her initial incision with a scalpel from the ambulance emergency kit, her movements precise despite the vehicle's motion and the improvised conditions. Years of surgical training had developed muscle memory that functioned independently of perfect circumstances, allowing her to work effectively even in the chaotic environment of a moving ambulance. As soon as she opened the abdominal cavity, Elena could see the source of Martinez's life-threatening bleeding. A piece of concrete debris had caused multiple lacerations to his spleen and liver, creating internal hemorrhaging that would have killed him within minutes without surgical intervention. "There," Elena said, her voice calm despite the gravity of what she was seeing. "Splenic laceration with active bleeding, plus liver trauma. I can control this." Using clamps and sutures from the ambulance's advanced life support kit, Elena began the delicate process of stopping the internal bleeding that was killing Martinez. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, identifying bleeding vessels and controlling hemorrhage with techniques that had once been second nature during her surgical career. Marcus watched in fascination as Elena worked, recognizing that he was witnessing emergency medicine at a level he'd never imagined possible. "I can't believe you're actually doing this," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Neither can I," Elena replied, not looking up from her work as she continued to control bleeding and repair damaged tissue. "But it's working. His blood pressure is stabilizing." Indeed, Martinez's vital signs were beginning to improve as Elena successfully controlled the major sources of internal bleeding. His pulse strengthened, his blood pressure rose to more sustainable levels, and his level of consciousness began to improve as adequate circulation was restored to his brain and vital organs. Elena worked for another 10 minutes, carefully inspecting the abdominal cavity for additional sources of bleeding and ensuring that her repairs would hold during transport to definitive surgical care. When she was satisfied that the immediate life-threatening hemorrhage was controlled, she began the process of closing the surgical incision. "How much longer to Arizona General?" Elena asked as she placed the final sutures. 5 minutes, Marcus replied, still staring at Elena in disbelief. "You actually did it. You performed surgery in a moving ambulance and saved his life." Elena secured the final suture and checked Martinez's vital signs one more time. Blood pressure was stable. Pulse was strong and regular, and he was fully conscious and alert. The emergency surgery had been successful beyond what anyone could have reasonably expected. "He's stable for now," Elena said, beginning to clean up the improvised surgical equipment. "But he'll need definitive surgical repair in a proper operating room. What I did was just enough to keep him alive until we could get him to the trauma team." The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay at Arizona General Hospital, where Dr. Santos and his trauma team were waiting. Elena helped transfer Martinez to the hospital stretcher, providing a concise surgical report that detailed the procedures she'd performed and the patient's current condition. Emergency laparotomy for splenic and liver lacerations. Hemorrhage controlled with direct pressure and suture repair, Elena reported with the professional precision of a surgeon presenting a case. Patient is stable but will require formal surgical exploration and possible additional repair. Dr. Santos stared at Elena as if seeing her for the first time. "You performed emergency surgery in an ambulance? With what equipment? Under what conditions?" Elena gestured toward the ambulance that had served as her operating room. "Standard EMS equipment, basic surgical supplies, improvised sterile field." It wasn't ideal, but it was sufficient to control life-threatening hemorrhage. Dr. Santos examined Martinez quickly, noting the professional quality of Elena's surgical work, despite the extraordinary circumstances under which it had been performed. "This is remarkable. The surgical technique is excellent, the repairs appear solid, and the patient is in much better condition than I would have expected given the mechanism of injury." Elena felt a surge of professional satisfaction that she hadn't experienced in 4 years. The successful surgery had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with medicine in the first place, and had demonstrated that her surgical skills remained sharp despite her time away from active practice. "He should do well with proper follow-up care," Elena said, watching as Martinez was wheeled into the trauma bay for further evaluation. Dr. Santos turned to Elena with obvious respect and admiration. "Dr. Rodriguez, what you just accomplished represents exactly the kind of innovation our mobile surgery program is designed to achieve. You've just proven that advanced surgical procedures can be performed successfully in pre-hospital settings when properly trained personnel have appropriate equipment and support." Elena realized that her emergency surgery on Martinez had inadvertently demonstrated the feasibility of the mobile surgery concepts that both Dr. Santos and Captain Harrison had been describing. She had proven that surgical intervention could save lives in situations where transport time to traditional facilities would result in preventable deaths. "It was a unique situation," Elena said modestly. "I'm not sure it represents a reproducible model for routine emergency care." "Maybe not routine," Santos agreed. "But it proves the concept. With proper equipment, training, and protocols, we could save lives that are currently lost because surgical intervention isn't available in pre-hospital settings." Elena found herself energized by the possibilities that Santos was describing. Her successful surgery on Martinez had reminded her of the profound satisfaction that came from using medical knowledge and surgical skills to preserve life. For the first time in 4 years, she felt the excitement of being part of advancing medical practice rather than simply maintaining existing systems. "It would require extensive development work," Elena said, her analytical mind already working through the challenges involved in creating systematic mobile surgery programs. Equipment design, training protocols, regulatory approval, quality assurance systems. Santos smiled with the enthusiasm of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. "Exactly the kind of challenges that make medical innovation exciting. Are you interested in helping us develop those systems?" Elena looked back at the ambulance that had served as her operating room, then at Marcus and Tyler, who were watching her with expressions of respect and admiration that she hadn't seen in years. She realized that her decision to perform emergency surgery on Martinez had already answered the question she'd been avoiding about her professional future. "Yes," Elena said simply, "I'm interested." Marcus stepped forward with a grin that transformed his entire face. "Does this mean you're finally ready to admit you're a doctor again?" Elena smiled, feeling lighter than she had in 4 years. "I suppose it does. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, trauma surgeon. It's nice to meet you properly." Tyler laughed, with the relief of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary. "This is the coolest thing that's ever happened on any ambulance call in the history of emergency medicine." Elena realized that Tyler was probably right. Emergency surgery performed in a moving ambulance was unprecedented, and the successful outcome would likely change how people thought about pre-hospital medical care. She had inadvertently become part of medical history while simply trying to save one patient's life. Over the following weeks, Elena's ambulance surgery became the subject of medical journals, conference presentations, and regulatory discussions about expanding the scope of emergency medical practice. She found herself at the center of national conversations about mobile surgery programs, advanced emergency procedures, and the future of trauma care. More importantly, she found herself excited about medicine again, working with Dr. Santos to develop mobile surgery protocols, training emergency personnel in advanced procedures, and designing equipment for pre-hospital surgical interventions filled her with the same passion that had originally drawn her to medical school. Elena accepted the consulting position with Phoenix EMS and the mobile surgery program at Arizona General, creating a unique professional role that combined her surgical expertise with her experience in emergency medicine. She began dividing her time between developing new medical procedures and training others to perform them, finding satisfaction in advancing the field while sharing her knowledge with the next generation of medical professionals. The guilt and self-doubt that had driven her away from surgery began to fade, as Elena recognized that her experience with patient loss had made her a more thoughtful and careful practitioner, not a damaged one. The 4 years she'd spent away from surgery had given her perspective and emotional resilience that enhanced, rather than diminished, her medical capabilities. Marcus became one of her most enthusiastic supporters, often telling the story of Elena's ambulance surgery to anyone who would listen. Their professional relationship evolved into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to advancing emergency medical care. 6 months after the construction accident, Elena performed the first official mobile surgery procedure as part of the pilot program she'd helped develop. The patient was a rancher who had been critically injured in a remote area where transport time to trauma facilities would have been fatal. Elena and her mobile surgical team were able to perform life-saving surgery in a specially equipped ambulance, demonstrating the viability of bringing operating room capabilities to patients rather than waiting for patients to reach operating rooms. Elena realized that her journey from hiding her medical identity to embracing it completely had led her to exactly where she belonged. She was using her surgical skills in innovative ways that pushed the boundaries of medical practice while helping to save lives that would have been lost under traditional emergency care models. Standing in her new mobile surgical unit, surrounded by cutting-edge equipment, and preparing for another challenging case, Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had returned to medicine not as the same person who had left surgery 4 years earlier, but as someone stronger, wiser, and more committed to making a difference in the world. The quiet woman who had been mocked and underestimated had proven that true strength often comes from those who choose their battles carefully and act decisively when lives depend on their courage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.